The day I couldn't get into my house, I wasn't scared. I laughed. Because if you're going to steal an old woman's life, at least pretend, my child. That's how it all begins. With a laugh stuck in my throat between the supermarket keys, the bags tearing, and the smell of fresh bread drifting in from the doorway. The sun beat on the back of my neck and sweat ran down my spine. But it wasn't the heat. It was the confusion. I put the key in again, turned hard, nothing. The lock wouldn't catch. I turned the other way, in case I'd mixed up the direction, because of course, when you're 70, there's always the suspicion that the crazy one is you. But no, it wasn't me. It was the door telling me my home wasn't mine anymore. I knocked once, twice, 3 times. From inside, a voice I know better than my own, my son's. Don't open, Mom's at the market. And then I felt something inside me break, as naturally as opening a bottle of water. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't move. I just stood there, key in hand, with a lucidity that ached in my gums. When they finally opened, my son appeared with that "it's fine" smile people use when they've decided something without asking you. Mom, we changed the lock. For safety, you know. For whose safety? I asked without blinking. He shrugged. Yours, of course. I looked at him. He had the same expression his father had when I caught him in a lie. That slight curl of the lip that says, I'm taking care of you, and really means I've already taken control. I went in. Everything was different. Not messy, not empty, but different. The curtains drawn, my framed photos on the table, a stack of papers that hadn't been there before, and a smell of disinfectant that felt foreign. The windows wide open, cold air pouring into a house that had always been warm. Deep clean, he said. The cleaning girl came to help me. But I was already counting steps in my head, measuring silences, noticing what was missing. My box of receipts, the blue insurance folder, my little notebook with the passwords. For safety. What a filthy word when it comes from your own. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, listening to the hum of the fridge, the tick of the hall clock, the echo of my breathing. And when I went down to the mailbox out of habit, I found it. An open envelope with my name misspelled. Inside, a paper folded in thirds. Cognitive Assessment Center. Appointment, Tuesday, 11. I hadn't requested it. At the bottom of the document, my son's phone number. I stood there holding the paper, my hand trembling but not with fear. With fury. Because suddenly, I understood my story hadn't started that day. It had been brewing for months, with low-voiced conversations, decisions made in cafes, fake smiles, and calls that hung up when I entered the room. I was the last to find out I no longer had a voice. The next morning I ran into my neighbor in the entryway. Did the insurance folks come already, Lydia? What insurance? The appraisal. They were here Tuesday. My blood boiled. Appraisal. My house. I didn't show anything. I smiled and went up slowly, like a good docile old woman. But let me tell you something. A woman who lived 40 years with an unfaithful husband and survived without losing her name doesn't get locked up so easily. So that very day, I opened the drawer where I keep my just-in-case things. My old black ledger, the accounts one, the copies of my deeds, and a phone number written in blue ink. Monroe, attorney. I didn't yet know why I'd call him, but something told me I'd need him. And before I go on, because believe me, what comes next is a movie I'm very curious to know from where in the world and at what time you're joining my story today. I'd love to read you in the comments to know if you've ever felt like a stranger in your own home. Because if I've learned anything, it's that the hardest blows make no sound, and that the worst theft isn't of money, it's of identity. When I went back up, I left the old key on the table. I looked at it for a moment, and I thought, if they're going to lock the door, let it be from the inside, and with my hand. On Tuesday at 11, I was going to pretend I didn't understand a thing. But that day, I promise you, I started to understand everything. The next morning, the doorbell rang 3 times in a row, with that insistence of someone who isn't afraid to bother because they think they have permission for everything. When I opened, I found a slight, dark-haired girl, an apron that looked freshly ironed, and an expression that mixed fatigue with obedience. She carried a folder under one arm and a thermos of coffee in the other hand. She looked at me with a nervous smile and said, without breathing, "Good morning, Mrs. Lydia. I'm here to help you with the housework." I didn't remember asking for help, nor having chores I didn't know how to do, but there she was, with the naturalness of someone entering a house where she was already expected. I asked who sent her, and she said, "Your son." She said it with mechanical kindness, like she was reading a script. I let her in because sometimes the best way to understand a plan is to play along. I watched her move through my kitchen, opening cupboards, putting away dishes, checking my fridge as if it were her own. She carried the smell of cheap lavender and a line of fear down her back. When she took out the pill organizer and started sorting my medication, I stopped her. "What are you doing?" She answered, "They gave me these new ones. They're better for sleep." I picked up one of the pills and held it to the light. It didn't look like mine. "And who exactly are you?" I asked, and her voice. I dropped a notch, almost a whisper. "I work for an elder care agency. They hired me to keep you company." The word company sounded like a decorated cage. I decided not to show anger. I made coffee, poured 2 cups, one for her and one for me, and sat at the dining table, the same one where years ago I signed the mortgage for this home. I looked her in the eye and said, "Julia, right? If you're going to keep me company, the least you can do is tell me where to." She lowered her gaze, toyed with the teaspoon, and murmured, "I shouldn't say this, but they're doing paperwork to admit you to a residence. The spot is reserved, ma'am. The deposit is already paid." A shiver ran up my spine, but I didn't let it reach my face. Instead, I smiled softly, as if she'd told me it was going to rain. "And how do you know that?" She wrung her hands. "Because I work with many families, and the procedure is always the same. They start with the lock, then they bring someone like me, and when everything's in order, they take you to a residence you don't come back from. I don't want to hurt you." In that moment, compassion bit me from the inside. She wasn't an enemy, she was a tool, another piece in a mechanism of guilt and convenience. I asked how old she was. She said 29, that she had a little girl back in her country, and they'd promised to regularize her if she did this job well. I asked if she thought she was doing the right thing. "No, but I need the money," she replied without looking at me. So I invited her to sit properly, because we were going to talk at length. As she told me her story, I was tying threads. The sudden visits from my son, the deep cleaning, the cut-off calls, everything made sense now. They'd prepared the ground the way you prepare a move, in silence, with mental boxes you don't see until they're full. Julia, in tears, showed me a message on her phone. It was from the agency. "Confirm admission, Mrs. Lydia Martín Las Moreras Center, tentative date, May 25. The air got thicker, but I kept smiling. "Don't worry, Julia," I said. "I'm not moving, but I thank you for telling me. Now tell me, what happens if you quit this job?" She shook her head. "They'd report me. I'm only in status as long as I work with you. If I leave, I lose my permit." Then I knew we were on the same side. She was trapped by need, and I by misunderstood love. 2 different women with the same fear, that others would decide for us. I stood slowly, went to the cupboard where I keep my good cups, and took out 2, the ones I only use when something important happens. "Let's make a pact, Julia," I told her. "You pretend to care for me, and I'll teach you how to survive." She laughed, half incredulous, but agreed. For the rest of the day, I watched her like someone studying a new map. Every time she moved, I learned something. How she spoke to my son, which calls she got, what glances she threw toward the door. I discovered she had a good heart but was afraid to use it. And I, always a practical woman, thought an ally with fear is worth more than a confident enemy. That night, when the house fell silent again, I sat by the window watching the lights in the building across the street. I thought about everything I'd lost without realizing it. The right to decide about my body, my home, my time. I also thought about how the word mother had turned into a synonym for incapable in my own children's mouths. And as the hall clock struck 12, I did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. Not for forgiveness, but for patience, because I was going to need it. On the floor, next to my slippers, I found the crumpled medical appointment slip. I smoothed it with my hand and tucked it into my black notebook. Let them keep playing, I thought. I know how to move pieces too. I don't know if it's ever happened to you, but there are moments when you feel your life jumps tracks without warning, like the train you were riding calmly suddenly veered into a dark tunnel. If it's happened to you, I'd like you to tell me. Before I continue my story, I'm very curious to know from where in the world and at what time you're joining today. I'd love to read you in the comments, to know if you've ever felt pushed somewhere you didn't want to go. That night, before bed, I watched Julia sleeping on the sofa in her work coat. There was peace and fatigue on her face, and on mine, a decision. If they were going to make me disappear, it would at least be on my terms. I closed my eyes and thought, tomorrow I start acting. The next morning, when I opened my eyes, my first thought wasn't fear or sadness, but strategy. I no longer asked, why are they doing this to me, but how are they going to do it, and what can I do first? Julia still slept on the sofa, curled up in her coat, phone in her hand as if letting go would make it vanish, her only link to the world. I watched her in silence for a few seconds, thinking youth is a luxury you don't value until you lose it, and obedience is sometimes a form of hunger. I made coffee quietly, opened the blinds, and decided that day I would begin my rehearsal of clumsiness, because if they wanted to believe I was losing my mind, I'd give them an award-winning show. Over breakfast, I feigned confusion. I spilled the coffee, called Julia by my daughter-in-law's name, and turned on the toaster without bread. She looked at me with a certain pity, as if madness were contagious. My son showed up unannounced, with the urgency of someone coming to close a deal, not visit his mother. Mom, you seem tired. Maybe you should let Julia help with the finances. I nodded with the sweetest falseness I could find. Yes, darling, you're right, lately I forget where I put things. He relaxed, and that triumphant look appeared on his face, giving me the confirmation I needed. They completely underestimated me, and that, at 70, is almost a blessing. After he left, I went to the utensils drawer and took out the old keys I'd kept since they changed the locks. Some were to doors that don't exist anymore, but one, the smallest, had a mark on the edge. It was for the son-in-law's office. That man always thought I understood nothing about documents, that all papers looked the same to me. What he never knew was that I worked 20 years at an engineering company and could read a blueprint like a novel. I slipped the key into my pocket and asked Julia to come with me to the neighborhood hardware store on the pretext of buying a new latch for the pantry. Lawrence, the hardware man, is one of those who look without asking. I asked for 3 copies of the key and a gesture of silence. The usual, he said, winking. While we waited, Julia watched me curiously, not understanding why an old lady needed so many keys. So, I won't get lost, I told her, and she smiled, though she didn't grasp that what I was really doing was finding myself. That night, when Julia went to her room, I slipped out with a small flashlight and a dark coat. The air was damp, the hallway lights flickered as if they were in on my mischief. I crossed to the son-in-law's office on the ground floor of the same building. The key turned with a soft click, almost conspiratorial. Inside, it smelled of new paper and expensive whiskey. I lit a single lamp and searched without touching too much. Folders, envelopes, files. Until I saw it. A document with my full name, my home address, and a signature that pretended to be mine. Sale property, Rosario Street 17. My flat. My name, my signature forged clumsily, as if done from memory and in a rush. I didn't feel rage. I felt a brutal clarity, as if suddenly everything fell into place. I slipped the paper into my coat, turned off the lamp, and left the way I came. Back at home, I turned on the dining room lamp and spread the contract on the table. I stared at the signature line by line with a mix of sadness and pride. I thought of my husband, How he always said money comes back, but trust doesn't. And there I was, trusting children who had decided to sell me like an old piece of furniture. Julia wandered into the living room half asleep, alarmed by the light. "What's wrong, ma'am?" I showed her the paper. She covered her mouth. "Is that?" I nodded. "My disappearance sentence, dear. But it isn't signed yet." She sat facing me and took my hand, trembling. "You can't stay quiet." "I won't," I said. "I just need you to understand something. From now on, what you see, you didn't see. What you hear, you didn't hear. Agreed?" She nodded, and in her eyes I saw something like respect. I spent the rest of the night going through old documents, comparing signatures, looking for stamps, dates, account numbers. I realized they'd moved more than I imagined. My bank papers, my insurance, even the deed to a small plot I inherited from my parents. It had all been handled, reviewed, tampered with. They did it so carefully, it must have taken months. That precision hurt most because it implied planning, coldness, and a total absence of love. When dawn crept through the window, my head was full of numbers, and my heart was stone. I decided that if they were treating me like a frail old woman, I'd become their worst nightmare, a lucid old woman with patience. And if the house was the stage for their theater, I'd memorize every script. That morning, while Julia made breakfast, I asked her to bring in the mail. Among the envelopes was a letter from the bank in my name. I opened it slowly. Authorization for change of digital signature. I smiled bitterly. "They're quick," I murmured. Julia asked if I wanted her to call my son. "No, let them play," I answered. "The more they think I don't know, the more they'll show me what they do." I looked out the window at the building opposite, where a woman my age watered balcony plants, unaware I was planning a domestic war. I thought how easy it is to erase someone when you call their age dependency. And I knew, without a doubt, that if I wanted to survive, I'd have to become invisible for a while, and then, when no one was looking, turn on the light. Julia brought me a notebook and said, "In case you want to write things down." I opened it, and on the first page I wrote big, in red ink, Plan A, pretend. Plan B, prove. Plan C, win. That was the day I stopped being a victim and started being the author of my story. And although I didn't yet know exactly how I'd do it, I had the most important things: a piece of evidence, an ally, and a calm so deep only those who no longer fear losing everything can have. Thursday afternoon, I found myself in the community meeting room, the air stale with two things: the leftover coffee smell from the previous meeting and that trail of papers that look more business than neighborhood. And when I went in, I felt a current run through me, not fear, but because for the first time I was where decisions were cooked, and the people who yesterday looked at me condescendingly now looked with the curiosity of someone discovering a neighbor who isn't just the lady who says hello in the elevator. The president, Don Albert, a man with a tight tie and measured smile, stood to greet me with that politeness you put on when it suits you. And when I sat, I began to sort the papers with my eyes, as if each sheet were a clue, and I had a magnifying glass in my head. "Lydia," said a neighbor with more years than hairs on her head, "good thing you came. We were going to discuss the elevator levy." Her voice was a thread, and I listened closely because threads often have knots. I asked to see the estimates, and they handed them. Over with that haste used by people who expect no resistance pages with rounded figures, company names with shiny logos, and dates stuck with tape that smelled of hurry. While the group chatted and some gossiped about the price per square meter in the city, I fixed my eyes on one invoice in particular, small, almost blank, from a company listed as Soluciones V&A, and because of a detail I noticed flipping the page, it had the same tax stamp that appeared on a contract I'd seen days before in the son-in-law's office. As a copy. I said nothing then. I preferred to observe. When Don Albert began explaining that the elevator repair was unavoidable and that they'd chosen, unanimously, the company offering the best guarantees, I pretended not to understand the technique of collective momentum, like someone listening to another language, until he, confident, let slip a phrase I've kept like a fossil. Mrs. Lydia doesn't understand these things. Better to go with the flow. The phrase fell like a bell, and though he said it officiously, I'd already recorded his voice in my head and on a little device hidden in my handbag since the night before. After the meeting, when the building emptied and the lights went out one by one with the slowness of those in no hurry, I followed Don Albert to the elevator and, under the pretext of checking a sheet, got close. His phone buzzed, and he either could not or would not avoid answering. Yes, I did the favor. The invoice goes out tomorrow, and we'll close the account to facilitate the transfer, he said, in a tone meant to be low and efficient, but that let the net show. Transfer, invoice, favor. I stood still, like part of the old lobby decor, and when I said goodbye with that old woman voice that pretends not to notice, I knew I'd opened a door larger than my home's lock. I didn't go home to celebrate. I'm not one to celebrate until the last paper's in hand. I walked to the newsstand, where Mr. Alfred trades papers for confidences, and asked him to keep some envelopes under the counter, to bring them out at the right time and not ask questions. He looked at me with that mix of admiration and caution only those who've survived many winters have. And he pulled out a box of cigars to offer me as a sign of shared secret, something I accepted with my customary irony. Because every secret you share stops poisoning you. That night, I laid out my notes on the dining table with the patience that, if it had a name, would be that of the weavers of old. A list of companies involved in the building's works, receipts with repeated stamps, payment orders with the same destination account, and a reason that repeated like a bitter aftertaste. The same manager appeared on several invoices. And that manager kept ties with an accounting office that, by coincidence or miracle, handled paperwork for the Las Moreras residents. As I turned the pages, I felt the board fill with pieces. It wasn't just an intention to sell my flat. It was a wheeled mechanism that made everything seem legal because it was fragmented enough for no one to connect the dots. I called Frank, my longtime neighbor, the man who looks like a sofa at first glance but has the brains of an old fox, and asked for help with something that sounded like a spy tale. Get me the old community minutes, the administrator changes, and the internal communications from the last 2 years. Frank answered with a short laugh and said, "You want to start a revolution, Lydia?" And I answered with the raw truth that theaters don't admit, "No, I want my home back." And he, who has the knack of moving papers like chess pieces, left an envelope under my window before midnight. Inside were the minutes, with redactions, swapped signatures, and a couple of printed emails that, read in sequence, made a suspicious chorus between the manager and the residence's accounting office. With that material, I sat in the kitchen and called Monroe. "I'm going to do something you won't find in any manual," I told him without preamble. And he let out his usual laugh over the phone, the one that sounds like the calm of courtrooms. "Whatever you do, don't do it alone. I can request a financial review and a handwriting expert, but you need witnesses, and everything must be clean, so they can't throw it out on a technicality," he warned. I proposed this, that Monroe formally request the community's proposals, and that, at the same time, I quietly gather evidence so as not to alert those rummaging in the drawers. While we planned, Julia arrived with a bag of bread under her arm and a look mixing relief and fear. She told me the agency had offered her future project compensation if she'd just help facilitate the move, and we looked at each other like people sharing the last spoon of pudding. An older skin still feeling the veins, and a younger one yoked by debts. "What if they're watching us?" she asked quietly. "They are," I answered, "but watching isn't the same as understanding, and that difference is our advantage." The night dragged on because I couldn't sleep, thinking about the emails in my hands and Don Albert's voice telling someone to close the account, a phrase looping in my head like a chorus. I looked for the original invoice in the file and compared it with another from the same company 6 months earlier for another building. Again, the stamp matched, and the same account number repeated in transfers to a shell company listed as purchaser of several properties in the city, and my old profession made me see what others didn't: a pattern. Not clumsiness, a system. Before lights out, I did something not on my old women do this list. I sent an anonymous message to the journalist. Laura had given me one cold, direct line. If you want stories, come to Taberna Cafe at 4. Bring recorders. It wasn't an invitation, it was a maneuver. And as I closed my eyes, for the first time since they changed the lock, I felt the house wasn't just where I slept. It was the board where I'd lay out the badly placed pieces of those who thought they could run everything from the shadows. At 4 o'clock sharp, the clock at Taberna Cafe marked the hour with that dry sound old clocks have, and I was already seated by the window with a café con leche gone cold from waiting. The journalist arrived in an overcoat too big for her, and a folder crammed with papers that seemed to weigh more than she did. She introduced herself as Sarah, firm voice, no frills, and said my sister Laura had told her about me, that she suspected behind private residences there was a network of property sales and fake medical reports. She watched me with the curiosity of someone unsure whether she's facing a victim or a source. And I liked that. I handed her copies of invoices, minutes, and the matches I'd found, and while she leafed through them, I told her how my house had been the starting point of something much bigger, how the elevator accounts linked to the son-in-law's office, and how the building president was just a link in a chain that smelled of corruption and easy money. Sarah listened with the focus of someone who knows truth rarely comes with applause, and at one point she looked up and said, almost to herself, that what I described wasn't isolated, that she'd heard similar stories in other neighborhoods. Elders declared incompetent in a matter of weeks, flats sold with dubious powers of attorney, children signing papers their parents had never seen. I'm not surprised, I said. When greed comes in the door, affection jumps out the window. We sat in silence a while, watching the traffic lights reflect on the glass. Before she left, she asked to record a future interview and promised discretion. I told her discretion was the only thing I could still afford. When I got home, Julia was waiting, frowning. She'd received a message from the agency. They asked her to confirm the date of my transfer and reminded her that her contract depended on her cooperation. She showed me the phone with trembling hands, and I saw in her eyes the terror that recognizes the smell of a trap. I took the phone gently and set it face down on the table. Let them think you're doing it, I said. Sometimes the best way to buy time is to pretend obedience. She looked at me, not fully understanding, and asked, what if they realize? If they do, dear, we'll be far from their game. That night, while she slept, I got a call that froze my stomach. It was Laura. I hadn't heard her in weeks, and her voice carried the echo of years when we were still sisters. Unvarnished, she said the son-in-law had visited. Lydia, he wants to convince you to sign a power of attorney, says it's to make your pension paperwork easier. I stayed quiet a few seconds and then asked if she'd agreed to anything. No, but he offered me money quite a bit, she confessed, and her voice mixed shame and defiance, like she wanted to test how far my faith in her went. I said the only thing I could. Don't get further into this, Laura, not because I think you're guilty, but because I know how this ends when blood mixes with money. But she, always the impulsive one, and let out a bitter chuckle. You're already in it, sister. You can't get out clean. And she hung up before I could answer. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the forged contract again, as if rereading the paper could give me new answers. It didn't, but it gave me something I needed: anger. The next day, I decided to pay a discreet visit to the building manager's office, a woman with a sweet voice and perfect nails who hid her cunning behind a school secretary's smile. I took a pretext, a common expenses bill. While she served me, I asked, feigning innocence, if she knew anyone at Las Moreras residence. Her smile tightened for a second, almost imperceptible, but enough. I've heard of them, she replied. Why do you ask? I held her gaze longer than courtesy allows and then smiled. Professional curiosity, ma'am. I've always liked understanding how elevators work, and falls. I left certain that everything was connected beyond what I'd imagined. I called Monroe from the corner and told him what I'd found. He said suspicion wasn't enough. We needed hard proof documents, audio, names, dates. Get me those, and I can move the case, he said. I hung up and took a deep breath. If the war had begun, I wouldn't fight it with indignation, but with precision. In the afternoon, when Julia returned from shopping, I noticed something different, more resolve. She told me she'd spoken with a coworker at the agency who also worked for a family with a similar case. Another elderly woman with supposed dementia and a son trying to sell the house before the diagnosis was official. She played me a voice message in which the supervisor asked her to ensure I took the right medication before next week's medical visit. The tone was so cynical, it almost made me laugh. "Then we'll give it," I said, "but it'll be the one I prepare." That night, I wrote a list of steps in my black notebook, the same one where I'd already detailed my plans. I added 3 new points: record conversations, intercept mail, and store copies outside the house. I realized I was no longer acting just to defend my home, but for something larger, for the simple need not to let them turn others into what they were trying to make of me. I felt a new calm, the kind that comes only when you accept there's no turning back. At midnight, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, the journalist. Brief: "I have names. I'll call tomorrow." I stared at the lit screen, knowing what came next would cost me friends, family, maybe some health, but also knowing it was too late to stop. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and lay awake a while, listening to the house's silence. The silence that used to scare me and had become my best ally, because inside it I could think, plan, resist. When I finally got up for bed, I ran my hand over the front door, the one they'd tried to make foreign, and promised myself something very simple. If anyone ever locked it again, it would be with my keys. The morning when everything became truly urgent didn't start with screams or assault, but with a thud that reminded me, in the most elemental way, I have a body, and sometimes it decides to speak when it least suits me. I was watering the balcony plants, feeling the cold soil between my fingers, when my heart gave a yank that left me breathless, with the certainty this wasn't a metaphor. I sat at the kitchen chair, pressed my forehead to the table, and waited for it to pass, like waiting for a train that won't come to return to its track, but it didn't pass. I called Julia with the voice I use when I don't want someone to panic, and she came running, still in her work clothes, hands shaking, and seeing me pale, she said bluntly, "Ma'am, we have to call an ambulance." And I looked at her with a calm that was deliberate and said, "No, call Monroe." Julia's breathing tore like paper, and she answered with that mix of obedience and panic that defines her. "But ma'am, what if it's serious?" "If it's serious, it'll be serious with the paperwork in order," I replied. "Call him and tell him to come and see." It wasn't contempt for the body, it was strategy. In a world eager to prove I don't understand, the least I can do is force a meeting between my health and my mind, so they face each other in the presence of someone with a legal face. While I waited, I smoked a slow cigarette. I keep for moments of theater and put on my robe, because I like people to see me put together when I'm about to give them bad news. Monroe arrived faster than I expected: tailored suit, judge-like glasses, and the ever-present folder that smells of legal ink and patience. He didn't ask about the heart scare. He checked my pulse with his fingers and said neutrally, "What do you need me to do, Lydia?" I explained I'd had an episode, that my son was at the office, and I feared a maneuver to have me declared incompetent based on medical risks, and that I wanted him to see my condition and, by the way, certify there was no cognitive decline to justify a petition already in motion, according to my information. "We can request a forensic evaluation and handwriting analysis, but I need evidence and witnesses," he said, and I offered him the teacup before me, 2 unopened sugar cubes, and a look that brooked no excuses. While we spoke, Julia came in with her phone and showed me the message from the agency. "If you don't facilitate admission, contract termination, and notification to immigration." The word immigration dropped in the kitchen like a slab, not just a work threat. It could rip from Julia something more valuable than salary: her permit, her chance to see her daughter. I stood, went to the shelf where I keep the things I salvage in case of catastrophe, took an envelope with €50 and handed it over without fuss. "Take this, go to your friend and tell her we need her. If they knock you out, we lose our witness. If they knock both of us, we have the edge." She hugged me with the gratitude of someone given water in the desert and promised silence. Then, true to my method, I turned the medical problem into a tactical edge. I made an appointment at the clinic for that afternoon and went with Frank, who showed up in his fix-it neighbor's coat and a better excuse than mine to present himself as a concerned friend. In the waiting room, fluorescent light falling on my skin like a photographic developer, they ran an EKG, an exam that smelled of hospital detergent and ancestral patients, and the tech, a young man with steady hands, looked at me with a mix of curiosity and respect when I asked aloud for results, so there'd be no doubts. "You have arrhythmia, but there's no sign of cognitive damage," he said, and I felt that small triumph that requires no celebration, whatever the clinical findings. My mind worked with the clarity of a lighthouse. With the report in hand, I went home and left it on the table like an exhibit in a museum, not for my children to see, but for the world to see at the right time. Monroe called that same afternoon. "With this, we can request an injunction preventing any administration of your assets until the matter's clarified." I asked him to do it, but he insisted on more than papers. We needed voice, not my testimony, but recorded conversations showing intent to defraud. "A judge appreciates an audio offering a spot in exchange for speeding up paperwork," he explained. "Also, a handwriting expert comparing your signature to the presumed forgery." So the house became an espionage office, with all the moral permissions I granted myself. We installed mics in unsuspected places that wouldn't seem threatening to my enemy's eyes. A borrowed clock I hung in the kitchen that kept time with lying precision, and 2 tiny devices hidden in flower pots. And I asked Frank to please watch the building's entrances during the hours couriers usually appeared with thick envelopes. Frank agreed with a smile that concealed pride and fear. "I'll play along, Lydia, but if this blows up, you owe me a couple of big beers." I promised more than beers. That night, as we set the stage for the next day, Julia confessed something that hit me like a sledgehammer because it shattered the naivete I still had about the hands around me. "The agency told me if you refuse to go, they can present a report claiming domestic risk, that you live alone and unsupervised. And with that, they can speed up the guardianship." The phrase had the chill of an automatic sentence. "Then we'll have to prove the opposite," I answered. "We have to show I live in a network, not in solitude, that there are neighbors, witnesses, people who can attest to my lucidity and my will." I called the seniors club president, the lady who runs the exercise classes, the parish priest who's known me forever. I explained the essentials and nothing more, and in under an hour I had commitments for them to come to the clinic, to provide brief notes on my condition, and to appear if needed before whoever summoned them. Never underestimate the strength of people who share the same sidewalk. When you ask a favor of those who've gone through the same thing, the answer is usually immediate. At night, with the distant hum of cars as a soundtrack, I reviewed the plan with Monroe over the phone, filing for injunctive relief, requesting handwriting analysis, and this made him furrow his brow, asking to open an investigation into the company on the elevator invoices and its supposed ties to the residents, for which we needed Sarah to run a piece, focusing on the practice, though without names, so the players would move more carefully and, with luck, leave a trail. We hung up with the feeling we'd nudged a domino tile and the effect would outsize us. Before sleep, I looked at the medical report on the table, the recordings in the devices, and the list of neighbors willing to testify, and for the first time in many nights felt a kind of exhausted satisfaction. These hands, the same ones that balanced the books and hemmed my husband's trousers, now signed a different script, a resistance that asked no permission. I went to bed with the tick of the new clock, marking the hours, and thought how my body had betrayed me to teach me a truth. Fragility is no excuse to have your voice stolen, and sometimes a scare catalyzes fear into strategy. When I woke the next day, my throat was dry and my head full of a deceptive calm, the kind that announces something's coming. Outside it rained like in old days, and on the kitchen table sat Julia, still wearing her coat, stirring coffee without drinking. She said she'd gotten another message, this time not just from the agency, but from an unknown number, brief and brutal. Remember what we agreed, the lady must be ready for transfer Thursday. Not a suggestion, an order. I asked for the phone, read it twice, and put it in my pocket without a word. I realized the girl wasn't just trapped. They were now using her as a rope, a way to make me move without touching me. So I breathed deep, understanding what was coming required cold blood, and cold is expensive at my age because the body shakes from holding it. I sat across from her and asked her to tell me everything she knew, leaving nothing out, and she began to speak in a low voice that almost blended with the rain. She explained the agency had agreements with 3 private residences, that they received a bonus per fast admission, that many caregivers were informants without knowing it, and that she'd heard her supervisor talk about my case as if it were already closed. The one with the big flat on Rosario. The one with the old papers. I asked if she knew the name of the woman sending those messages, and when I heard Alicia Valcarcel, a chill ran through me, because I'd seen that surname before. It was on the elevator invoices, on the intermediary company, in the printed emails Frank had slipped under my window. Everything fit, and what had been loose pieces now formed a picture so sharp it was frightening to look at directly. I called Sarah, adrenaline humming with the discovery, and told her about the message and the name Alicia. She asked me not to do anything yet, that she needed to verify the information and had a contact inside one of the residences, someone willing to talk if I guaranteed anonymity. I told her at my age I guarantee nothing, but that I'd follow her advice and wait. Waiting didn't mean standing still, so I decided to do what had been circling my head for days. Visit my son unannounced, because his place surely held more than he imagined he could hide. I prepared the visit like a theater scene. Neutral clothes, weary expression, hands shaking just enough to look vulnerable. Julia insisted on coming, and I let her, because her presence would make my role more believable. When I opened the office door, he feigned surprise, that clumsy surprise that doesn't fool a mother. He kissed my cheek too quickly and offered a seat. I spoke slowly, letting him believe the arrhythmia had left me fragile, and asked if he knew anything about a transfer to a residence. He shifted in his chair and said no, those were my ideas. But while he spoke, he kept glancing at the phone on the desk, as if waiting for it to vibrate. Then it did, and like a child caught red-handed, he lowered his eyes. I managed to read on the screen, just for a second, a name I already knew, A. Valcarcel. I asked for a glass of water to buy time, and as he stood, I set my hand on the papers on the desk. Bank statements, accounting documents, and a sheet that looked like a draft application for administration of assets. The heading read, Lydia Martin Gomez Preventive Guardianship Process. A stab hit my chest, but I didn't move. I took the water, feigned clumsiness, and spilled it over the paper. He jolted, rushed to dry it, and in that clumsy scramble I saw what I needed. The date 2 weeks old, and the signature my own son's. I went home without saying a word, stomach in knots and a serenity heavy as lead. Julia waited, anxious, and when I told her, she broke down in impotent tears and hugged me like hugging her own mother. I told her not to cry, that crying wastes time, that we'd use every hour before Thursday became a sentence. I called Monroe and asked him to come at once. When he arrived, I spread the damp papers across the table and told him everything. He looked in silence, touched them carefully, and said something I hadn't heard from his mouth before. This is big, Lydia, and dangerous. If we move without solid proof, they could turn it on us, accuse you of paranoia or manipulation. I said I had no intention of stopping. Then he pulled an envelope from his case and set it before me. A preliminary objection to guardianship, ready to file if I could show deceit and conflict of interest. You have to get them to expose themselves, he said. A conversation, a call, something. I spent the whole afternoon figuring how to prompt that conversation without seeming to seek it. The simplest occurred to me, fake surrender. I called my son and said, softly, that I'd thought about what he proposed, that maybe the residence wasn't a bad idea, that I felt tired. There was silence on the other end, then his voice half astonished, half relieved. Mom, I promise it'll be best for everyone. We agreed he'd come the next day to explain the details. When I hung up, my hands shook not from fear, but from contained rage. Julia watched me without a word. I barely slept that night. My body felt heavy, my heart unsettled, but my mind more awake than ever. At midnight, I wrote in my notebook, "Tomorrow, trap. Listen, record, keep quiet." I checked the devices, charged the recorders, and made sure everything was in place. Outside, the rain kept falling with that calm that heralds a storm, and I felt, with a mix of fatigue and resolve, that Thursday would not be the day they took me. It would be the day I caught them. When the clock struck 3, I closed the notebook and turned out the light. In the dark, I thought how sometimes life boils down to a small scene. A mother feigning weakness, a son believing himself strong, and a truth that, when it finally surfaces, forgives no one. Thursday dawned with a deceitful sun, the kind that shines too soon and makes you think everything will be fine while sensing something will blow before nightfall. I woke before Julia, dressed with the ritual calm of someone preparing for a fight. White blouse, the pearl necklace I save for funerals and victories, and an old perfume that smells like memory. Looking in the mirror, I thought nothing is sadder than dressing to betray your own son, and still I didn't tremble, because love, when it twists, becomes something that doesn't tolerate hesitation. At 10, the bell rang, and his voice came from behind the door, warm, rehearsed the voice of someone coming to close a deal, not to ask forgiveness. I opened slowly, feigning surprise, and he came in with the same old smile, loaded with papers, an envelope, and that look that avoids yours when it knows it's lying. Behind him came my daughter-in-law, arms crossed, and they both sat opposite me like real estate agents, and I the client. Julia stayed in the kitchen, but I knew she was listening to every word. "Mom," he began, using that childlike tone people adopt when they want to be forgiven before saying the barbarity. "We came to talk about the residence. Everything's arranged. Just a few signatures and minor things left. You'll like it, garden, clinic, activities, all included." I asked in the meekest voice I could find, "And how much does that all included cost?" He laughed, uncomfortable. "Don't worry about that. What matters is your peace of mind." "Right," I said. "Peace of mind is the only thing you can buy with an old woman's house, isn't it?" Julia coughed in the kitchen, smothering a nervous laugh. I folded my hands on the table, nails perfectly aligned, and waited for him to pull out the papers. When he did, I breathed slowly, because this was the moment I'd been waiting for. He laid out the contract glossy pages, small print, and pointed to where I should sign. "Here, Mom, just confirm you agree to the provisional guardianship. It's a formality that protects all of us." "All of us?" I asked, dry. "Or you and your accounts?" He stared, trying to read whether I knew more than I let on. I said nothing, just nodded with a tired gesture, the gesture of a woman resigned. While he talked, I placed my hand over the remote I'd hidden under a tablecloth and pressed gently. From the wall clock in the kitchen, the innocent one, every word began recording. I let him keep talking, let him sink himself, let him say everything he'd planned. "Look, Mom, this is for your good. The lawyer already checked everything, and selling the house lets us cover your expenses without worries. Plus, Julia can keep working with you if you behave with the administration." The phrase burned my skin. Julia came in with a tray of coffee, and I knew she was ready. Her phone, tucked among the cups, was recording too. I signed a fake sheet I'd prepared with Monroe, an invalid copy so they'd think they'd won. When I looked up, I saw something I'll never forget. My son's satisfied smile, the one I recognized from the mirror of his childhood when he did something forbidden and thought no one would catch him. I waited for them to drink their coffee, for the air to fill with that feigned calm before a storm, and then I pressed the remote again. The living room TV switched on by itself, black screen, and then a voice, his. "Close the deal before month's end, Alicia. The old woman has no clue." The silence that followed was absolute, one of those pauses scripts never include because no one could bear them. The recorded voice went on. Conversations, dates, payments, everything. My son's expression changed, first disbelief, then fear. My daughter-in-law stood, pale, and blurted, "What did you do, Lydia?" I stood slowly, feeling each bone weigh centuries, and yet my voice came out firm. "What you did, but done properly." From my purse I pulled a sealed envelope, the one Monroe had given me, and set it on the table with a sharp thud. "There's my lawyer's letter. Revocation of powers, a complaint for forgery, and a request for an investigation by the prosecutor. And while we're at it, the journalist who called me a bit ago has a copy too." My son put his hands to his head. "You can't do this, Mom. You'll destroy us." "No, darling, I'm not destroying you. You took care of that yourselves. I just turned on the light." Julia was paralyzed, but her eyes said more than words. She knew it was over. My daughter-in-law tried to keep control, called me cruel, ungrateful, and I simply laughed, a dry laugh that comes when you realize shame no longer belongs to you. "Cruel," I repeated, "is selling your mother to buy a new car. Ungrateful is not throwing you out sooner." They both stood, gathered their papers, soaked in defeat, and left without saying goodbye. When the door closed, my body buckled as if all the years' weight suddenly fell on me, but I didn't cry. Julia hugged me tight, sobbing, "You did it, ma'am." I moved her gently aside, looked her in the eye, and replied, "No, Julia, we did it. Wars you win alone aren't worth anything." The rest of the day was a parade of calls. Monroe confirming he'd received the audio, Sarah asking permission to use voice clips in her piece, and Laura, my sister, calling between tears and laughter to say she'd seen the local news that finally someone was talking about what they do to the old. At nightfall, I poured a glass of wine and opened the window. Outside, the air smelled like cleanliness after a storm, and for the first time in a long time I felt I could breathe, without fear of tomorrow. Julia made tea in the kitchen, humming a song I didn't know, and it felt like a sign of life, of continuity. At 11, I sat in my armchair and looked at my home's reflection in the glass. At last it looked as it should, mine. I thought of my son, how ambition had stolen his tenderness, how lies are inherited like mannerisms. And I felt something like sadness, but cleaner, like closure. I turned off the TV, put the recorder in the drawer, and before bed, I wrote one last line in my black notebook. "Truth doesn't bring peace, but it brings dignity." Then I turned out the light, knowing what began with a changed lock was about to end with an open door. The next morning dawned strange, as if the city had half woken up, and for the first time in weeks I didn't feel stalked inside my own house, though I didn't feel relief either. Because when truth surfaces, it doesn't bring peace, it brings consequences. Julia was still sleeping, exhausted from the tension of the day before, and as I watched her, I thought that people like her, the ones who show up in the middle of a shipwreck, are the ones who end up keeping the boat afloat without even realizing it. I put on the coffee, opened the window, and let the cold air in without asking permission, with the kind of violence sometimes needed to clean what rots in silence. On the table, the phone buzzed again and again. Unknown numbers, and I didn't need to answer to know who they were. Those who smell fear when it's already too late. Those who try to douse a fire with soft words. Mid-morning Sarah called, her voice riding the line between excitement and worry. She told me the recording was already with the prosecutor, and the paper had published in advance, a short piece in the local section that didn't mention my name, but did outline the scheme. Private residences, real estate companies, guardianship contracts, a well-oiled network of people in expensive suits and cheap consciences. "They can't hide it now," she said. "They'll have to answer." I stayed silent a few seconds, listening to traffic through the phone. "Sarah," I said, "just make sure this doesn't become a one-day story. Don't let them say tomorrow it was a misunderstanding. What they did to me, they've done to hundreds of others, and those people have neither voice nor microphone." She promised to follow the thread to the end, though the fatigue of someone who knows big truths devour their messengers was already in her tone. That afternoon, Frank came knocking with the paper folded under his arm. He said nothing as he came in, just left it on the table, pointing at the headline, "Prosecutor investigates alleged network of residences and illegal property sales." I sat to read, slowly, savoring each word like pieces of clean air after so much smoke. The article spoke of an anonymous woman who had exposed the network from within, of audios, witnesses, cross-invoices. My name wasn't mentioned, but the whole city would know. A pang hit my chest, not fear, exposure. My calm was gone for good, but so was the silence, and that felt a fair price. Julia heard about the publication from a coworker and burst in with a gaze tangled between panic and hope. She told me they'd fired her that morning, that the supervisor yelled in front of everyone she was a traitor, that she'd brought the police into the business of important people. They kicked me out without pay, without papers. They threatened to report me for labor fraud, she said, eyes brimming. I went to her and set my hand on her shoulder. They can't do worse to you now, Julia. The worst already happened, and if anyone dares lay a hand on you, they'll have to go through me first. She cried quietly a while, and then, with a new courage growing between her ribs, told me she wasn't leaving, that if this was the end, she wanted to stay to the last minute. She said it with a firmness that reminded me of myself years ago, when I still believed resisting was a form of love. In the afternoon, Monroe came with his steady, tired step. He brought a new folder and a look I couldn't read until he sat down. Lydia, I spoke with the prosecutor this morning. The investigation has widened, but we also received something I didn't expect. From his case, he took a folded document, a request for precautionary measures for administration of my assets, filed by my son 2 days before everything blew up. It had been granted temporarily while the larger complaint proceeded. They want to freeze your accounts, your payments, everything. They say it's to protect you from yourself. I stared at the sheet without touching it, not surprise, not rage, but a kind of resigned incredulity. So they still think I'm the problem, I murmured. Monroe nodded. Yes, and they'll use that to defend themselves, to say you're unstable, that all this was a confusion from a sick mind. I stood, walked to the window, and breathed deep. Outside, the sky had gone gray, the kind that announces a storm that won't fall yet. Then what we have isn't enough, I said. We need more. We need others to speak. Monroe looked at me, half warning, half respect. If you expose yourself more, it could be dangerous. There's no danger when your safety's already been taken, I replied. Only paths. That night, I went to the community center where the seniors meet. They received me with the quiet affection of people who understand without asking. I told them what had happened, no frills, no victimhood, just facts. The papers, the sale, the network. One by one, they raised their voices with their own versions. A neighbor who lost his home after signing something he didn't understand. A woman who hadn't seen her mother in a year because the administration didn't consider her fit for visits. I realized what happened to me was just one thread of a massive net growing for years under our noses. That meeting changed everything. We formed a group, decided to write a joint letter to the judge with names, dates, documents. Sarah offered to use her outlet to amplify the voices, and Frank, always more action than words, proposed an open neighborhood assembly. We can't pretend this doesn't happen, he said. If we stay quiet, tomorrow it's our turn. That night I went home with Julia and felt something I hadn't in a long time: belonging. My fight, which began as a desperate act to defend my home, had become a small but real movement, a chain of people seeing and recognizing one another. When I sat on the bed, tired but alive, Julia brought tea and said, "Look, ma'am, I used to think life was about holding on until the fear passes. But you taught me fear only leaves when you face it." I smiled and wished my son had half her clarity. Before sleep, I opened my black notebook and wrote slowly, a steady hand. When others hide, speaking becomes a way to breathe. Then I turned out the light and lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the house's clean silence, a silence that no longer felt like a threat, but a promise. Outside, the building's lights flickered as if clapping in code, and I fell asleep certain that what began with a new lock was about to open a much bigger door, one that no longer belonged only to me. The following days were a parade of envelopes, calls, and visits that never ended, each more calculated than the last. and in the middle of that bureaucratic noise, I began to notice something changing around me, as if people had started to see me differently. No longer as a stubborn old woman refusing to leave her home, but as a woman who, without seeking it, had become an uncomfortable mirror for many. The news had spread through the neighborhood, and on every corner, someone stopped me to tell a similar case. A uncle, a grandmother, a neighbor who'd been made to sign things they didn't understand. There was no comfort in it, but there was fuel. The harm was bigger than my story, and suddenly my body didn't ache as much because the anger had turned into a purpose that kept me upright. Sarah called again, her excitement obvious in her breath. She said she'd obtained documents proving the residence company and the real estate firm not only shared a tax address but also partners. 3 appeared as political donors, and 1 had public works contracts including community elevator maintenance across half the city. I listened while stirring sugar into my coffee, and the spoon's clink sounded like a ticking bomb. She asked for more recordings, more details, anything to make the story impossible to bury. "Truth needs noise," she said, and I thought she was right, but noise also draws rats when they feel cornered. That same afternoon, a gray car parked in front of my building, not one of my neighbors. I saw it from the window and knew someone was watching. I didn't feel fear. I felt a bitter satisfaction. If they were watching me, things were going according to plan. I went down to the lobby under the pretext of checking the mailbox and crossed paths with the driver, a young man in a suit, pretending to talk on the phone. I looked him straight in the eyes and said in my best harmless grandma voice, "Tell whoever sent you to at least change cars that model guzzles gas." He was speechless, and I went back up feeling I'd won a small round of dignity. That night Frank brought more documents. He'd accessed minutes from another building where the same elevator company had done work at inflated prices, and the transfers went to the same account number. That coincidence gave me an idea. Cross-reference. I spent 3 whole nights comparing invoices, dates, amounts, names. Numbers, which had always felt cold to me, began to have faces, smells, histories, and at the center of it, all. That repeated name like an invisible signature, Valcarcel. The network had tentacles everywhere, and my flat was just one brick in its wall of lies. With Monroe's help, we assembled a full dossier with evidence and names and took it to the prosecutor. It was a humid morning, the kind of humidity that sticks to the skin like a warning. The prosecutor, a man with a grave voice and spotless hands, listened with a seriousness that made me wonder whether he believed or was simply sizing the scandal. In the end, he set his pen down and said, "This isn't just real estate fraud, Mrs. Lydia, this is organized crime." A chill ran through me, because hearing those words from an official is like seeing your nightmare stamped on letterhead. As I left the courthouse, the air tasted different. Julia waited outside, tense, coat buttoned to her throat. She'd gone to the bank and discovered my accounts were still frozen by order of the guardianship judge. She handed me the paper with cold hands, and as I read it, she told me in a low voice that the building president had disappeared. He'd left without a word, with a small suitcase and a guilty silence. I knew then. Someone inside the network had started moving pieces to erase traces, and that meant we were winning. That night the phone rang again. My son's voice answered, not shouting, not begging, just tired, as if the weight of what he'd done had finally dropped on him. "Mom, I didn't want it to be like this. I got into something I didn't understand," he said. I closed my eyes and counted to 3, not to calm down, but to line up words so they came out steady. "Son, when you sign against your mother, you understand exactly what you're doing. Whether you want to own it is another thing." There was a long, almost tender silence, and for a moment I thought he'd cry, but he just sighed and hung up. I didn't cry either. Instead, I opened the black notebook and wrote, "Regret doesn't change facts, but at least it lights them." Then I went to the window, looking at streetlights and passing car shadows, feeling a strange mix of defeat and victory, of end and beginning. The next day, Sarah called early, sounding more urgent. She told me one of the names on the transfers, a certain Mendez, had been arrested at dawn, and in his statement he'd mentioned the director of Las Moreras and 2 municipal officials. "They're falling, Lydia, piece by piece. she said. And I thought justice, when it comes, always does so like a wounded animal, slow, clumsy, but unstoppable. In the afternoon, the prosecutor summoned me to sign an extended statement. I went alone, without Julia, because I wanted to look straight at the place where my story had become a case file. As I signed, he told me something that stuck. "You didn't just save your house, ma'am. You opened a crack in a wall that stood for years." I walked back with those words bouncing in my head. And for the first time, I allowed myself a bit of pride, the kind you don't say aloud because it sounds like conceit, but that warms your chest when the world finally believes you. That night, Julia turned on the TV, and the news talked about the case, the arrests, the business links. They didn't mention my name, but I heard it anyway in an elderly woman that appeared. I looked in the mirror with the newscast behind me and saw myself different, steadier, more me. I thought of all the times they made me feel age was a defect, and how now it was my best weapon. Patience, memory, the experience of having seen it all and still being on my feet. Before bed, I wrote in the notebook, "When you pull a thread, you don't know whose life you'll unravel. But sometimes, to sew again, you have to rip first." I left the notebook open on the table because I knew it wasn't over, that tomorrow would bring new wounds and maybe some repair, and though I was tired, I still had strength to see this cycle close, which had unwittingly grown much larger than me. 2 weeks passed that felt like a lifetime, days that mixed relief and unease, because when truth prevails, it doesn't leave only others' ruins. It disarms you, leaves you staring at the emptiness once the fight is over. The press didn't stop. TV replayed images of handcuffs, lawyers coming and going from courts, doors with logos, dark cars speeding away. The headlines no longer read, "Elderly woman defends her home." Now they said, "Residents Network falls to citizen complaint." Sarah called to read me a passage from her big Sunday feature. And listening to her, I realized she no longer sounded like a journalist chasing a story, but a friend telling the end of something we both survived. Monroe came every 3 days with updates, documents, clippings. His tone had changed, from cautious skepticism to a kind of paternal pride. One noon, he sat across from me, opened his folder and, almost solemnly, told me the judge had nullified the sale, the guardianship was void, and my name was once again sole, rightful owner. I said nothing. I just stared at the document, black letters, my name cleanly printed, and thought how absurd it is that justice takes so long to return to a person what was already theirs. I signed where he pointed, and when I looked up, he was smiling. "You did it, Lydia. Against all odds, you did it." I answered the first thing that came from my soul. No, I got it back. Not the same thing. I didn't want dinner that night. I lit a candle, poured a glass of wine, and sat by the window. A fine rain fell over the balconies, and the air smelled like freshly washed earth, like a beginning. Julia was making soup in the kitchen, humming a sad song that escaped her, and I listened like you listen to the echo of another life. Suddenly, I remembered my son as a child, his little hands playing with the house keys, his laughter hiding behind the curtains, and my chest tightened not with nostalgia, but with a tenderness that survived, despite everything. I cried slowly, quietly, with the dignity we women learn when we've had to be strong even when it wasn't necessary. The next morning his call came, my son's. The voice was different, lower, broken. He didn't ask forgiveness, but he didn't need to. He said he was leaving the city, that he needed to think, that things had spun out of control, that money had blinded him. I listened in silence. "I don't hate you, son," I said at last, "but I won't justify you either. I don't wish you ill, but I won't be waiting." A long, heavy silence, then he hung up. I looked at the phone like an old wound that finally stopped hurting. Sarah came a few days later with a small crew. She wanted an interview for the TV version of her story. I agreed, with one condition: that my face not be shown, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted the voice to be anonymous, so it could be anyone's. We sat in the living room, curtains half open, light falling in soft diagonals. She asked how it started, what I felt, how I knew they were robbing me. I answered calmly, with that serene irony that settles once you've walked through fire. I told her about the lock, the spilled coffee, the audio on the TV. When we finished, she sat quiet a few seconds, then said, "You don't know how many people will see themselves in your story." I smiled and replied, "That's the sad part and the beautiful part at the same time." That afternoon I walked the neighborhood. The air had a new light, as if everything were sharper. I passed the flower lady on the corner. She gave me a bunch of lilacs. "For being brave," she said. I thanked her without words, because sometimes gratitude is bigger than phrases. I walked to the park where I used to take my son as a boy and sat on the same bench. I watched an elderly couple walking hand in hand and realized that life, despite everything, kept to its routine, aloof and generous. When I returned, Julia was on the phone with her daughter. I saw a smile I'd never seen on her. With the lawyer's help and a statement from me, she'd regularized her status. She hugged me tight and said, "Now I can bring her, ma'am." I nodded, and for the first time in a long while, felt there was something like justice in the world. That night I wrote the last page in my black notebook. I wrote slowly, clearly, so there'd be no doubt. They tried to lock me in, and I ended up opening every door. I didn't win a war, but I got back my name, my home, and my voice. And that, at my age, is victory enough. I closed the notebook, put it in the drawer next to the new keys, my keys, and turned out the light. Before sleeping, I listened to the rain returning to the roof and thought maybe life isn't about resisting always, but knowing when to stop fighting. I fell asleep with that idea, heart at ease, knowing that even if time runs short, the story no longer belongs only to me, but to anyone who ever felt someone change their lock without asking. And there, between sleep and memory, I saw myself again, standing at my door, key in hand, smiling. Because yes, they wanted to put me in a home, but in the end, I'm the one who locked them up. And that's how my story ends, or at least this part. I don't know if I won, but I'm still here, in my house, with my cup of coffee and my keys where they belong. If you made it to the end, thank you for keeping me company. I'd love to know what you would have done in my place, or if you ever felt they were erasing you from your own life. Tell me in the comments. I read them all, believe me. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this real, flesh and bone, with a little anger and a touch of hope, subscribe and stick around. I've still got many doors to open.